Hey y'all, it's Jazz, your fave mental health enthusiast, and welcome back to Jazz's Corner, where we discuss all things related to mental wellness. And in today's video, we're going to be having a very important conversation about boundaries. It'll be a very productive conversation about the types of boundaries, the boundary violations, setting boundaries, the importance of setting boundaries, how to honor your boundaries as well as other people's boundaries, and some tips for setting and keeping boundaries. I just said boundaries so many times. Every time you hear me say boundaries in this video, take a sip of water. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. Okay, let's get started. I just want to make sure y'all were hydrated. So there are different categories of boundaries, and I'm going to go through each of the ones that I know about, which is roughly around 6. And I'm going to give an example of what it looks like when that boundary has been violated and how to set a boundary when it has been violated. The interesting thing about boundaries is that we never really think that we need them until we feel as though our wants and needs have been violated in some way. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the different categories of boundaries that I know about, and I'm going to give an example of what a boundary violation would be, and then how to set an official boundary after the violation has occurred. In the words of our great father Pray Tell from Pose, the category is material, and that is related to anything that is tangible that can be given or loaned to others, such as money, clothes, and cars. And so what a boundary violation in a material sense would look like is if you have loaned someone, let's say, a large sum of money, and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna pay you back, I'm definitely gonna pay you back, and then they don't pay you back. So now you're feeling some type of way because you're like, I just loaned this person, let's say it was $50. I just loaned Gary, sorry to all the Garys out there, I just loaned Gary $50, and Gary does not seem like they will be paying that money back, or at least paying it back anytime soon. And so what it would look like if you set a boundary around that is to say, hey Gary, I don't feel comfortable lending you any more money until you pay back the $50 that I originally loaned you. And you know, Gary might get up in arms, Gary might get upset about that, but that is your way of protecting your pocketbook and not loaning out money that you can't really stand to lose. $50 might not seem like a lot in the moment, but if you loan Gary $50 4 times, then you have loaned Gary a total of $200. And Gary's like, yeah, no, I'm not paying that back. And now you definitely feel as if you have been bamboozled. So moving into the next category, which is physical boundaries, those are related to physical space, touch, your physical needs. And what a boundary violation in that sense might look like is if you go over to a family member's house and you communicate with them and say, hey, I actually really don't like to be hugged. But yet every single time you go to this family member's house, they go in for the hug. They go in for the big squeeze, and you're just standing there feeling very, very uncomfortable. That is a violation of your physical space because you have told that family member, hey, I don't like to be hugged. So in this scenario, you have already set the boundary. You've already said, hey, I don't like to be touched. And they have essentially disregarded what you were saying. So the best thing to do is to reinforce that boundary and communicate with them and say, hey, I didn't really appreciate the way that you kind of disregarded my boundary just now. I said that I prefer not to be hugged, and you still went in for the hug. And it might be very uncomfortable in the moment, but if you don't vocalize your discomfort, then they're going to continue to hug you. They're going to continue to disregard that boundary that you set up. In the process of communicating the boundary violation with them, they might counter and say, it's just a hug, like, why are you bugging so much? And it's not even about that. It's just the fact that I communicated with you what I preferred and you disregarded it. So even though it's just a hug, I prefer to not just be hugged. The third category of boundaries that I would like to speak about are mental boundaries, and those are related to your thoughts, your opinions, your values. And what a boundary violation in that sense might look like is if you are engaging in a conversation with someone, and every single time you engage in a conversation with this person, they're trying to sway you into accepting their point of view. They completely disregard your own point of view, and they invalidate your own point of view, and they say, hey, you need to accept my point of view. That is a clear violation of your right to have your thoughts and your opinions. And what setting up a boundary about that might look like is saying, hey, I'm down to engage in these conversations with you, but where I draw the line is when you invalidate my own personal beliefs and opinions. It's like, we can have this dialogue, but it's not okay if you're going to completely invalidate where I'm coming from and try to push your own point of view on me. Like, sometimes it's okay to disagree. Like, it's okay. We don't all have to be on one accord all the time. The fourth category of boundaries that I would like to bring up are emotional boundaries, and those have to do with honoring and respecting the way that you are feeling and your emotions. And so what a boundary violation in that sense might look like is if a friend texts you and says, hey, something bad happened to me, I had a bad day, can I chat with you about it? And then let's say you're not in a place where you can hold that space for them, and you communicate that to them and said, hey, I don't feel as though I can hold that space for that right now, maybe later. And yet your friend completely ignores what you have just said, ignores what you just communicated to them, and they're like, okay, so first I went to work, and then Sally Mae was hogging the coffee maker, and then I went to go make copies, and the printer was broken, and then my boss came in, and she was telling me to do all these things, and I had to work through my lunch. And you're just like, whoa, I literally just said that I was not in a place where I could hold space for this conversation. That is a boundary violation, because as much as we want to be there for our friends and hold that space, sometimes for various reasons we cannot. So as long as you have communicated with them prior to them engaging in that boundary violation, and you've said, I'm not in the space to but to engage in a dialogue about what it is you're wanting to speak about, it's okay to enforce that boundary and say, hey, I'm going to be bringing this conversation to a stop because I previously communicated and said that I was not in a place where I could hold that space, and I'm going to honor my feelings and emotions and step away from this conversation. Whether or not you want to resume that conversation later after the boundary violation has occurred, that is completely up to you. So the fifth boundary that I like to speak about are sexual boundaries, and that's really just anything to do with sexual activity. And so a boundary violation in that sense might look like asking your partner to use a form of contraception and they say no. And so what it might look like when setting a boundary in that regard is not engaging in sexual activity with that individual until a form of contraception is used. I feel like I could give so many different examples because in contemporary society, there has been a lot of discussion about, consent, women's bodies, reproductive rights, and for all of that, I have to say, set that boundary. No means no. Your body is your body. Period. Like, that's it. Moving along. The final boundary that I'd like to speak about are time boundaries, and those are related to how you choose to spend your time. So for the purposes of this scenario, let's say you are an artist and you like to draw, but you also sell your drawings, and you have a family member or a friend that comes up and they're like, hey, can you draw X, Y, and Z for me? And there's no real discussion about payment. There's no real sense of understanding regarding what all would go into drawing something for them. There's just this expectation that because y'all are friends or because y'all are family members that you have to fulfill this request. And that is absolutely a boundary violation. What setting a boundary around that would look like is communicating with them and saying, hey, I'm open to fulfilling this request. Or if you're not open to fulfilling a request, you could just say that too. That would be setting a boundary as well. I'm not open to this request. So, but for the purposes of this scenario, we're open to fulfilling this request with some modifications. So communicating with them and saying, I'm open to fulfilling this request, but I am requesting a form of payment because this is a lot of time and labor that goes into this. And if you are on board with that, then we can engage in discussions about it, but I will not be fulfilling this request for free because my artwork is not free 99, and neither is my time. And it's okay to set the boundary at any time. Even if you used to do free artwork, it's okay if you no longer want to do free artwork. It just starts with setting that boundary, and those who are down with that will be down with that, and those who are not down with that, they won't be down with that. It's okay. So those were all of the different categories of boundaries that I wanted to discuss, and now I would like to discuss the importance of setting boundaries. The first one being that boundaries are an act of self-love and a form of self-care. So I'm actually a huge promoter of self-care. I actually have a video on self-care. Check it out if you haven't already. But self-care requires you to be intentional with what you are doing. It requires you to dig deep into your wants and needs. So when you are setting a boundary, it requires the same thing. It requires you to think about, why am I setting this boundary? What is the need? Where does the need for this boundary stem from? And that is a form of self-love because you're doing that work to understand why the boundary is necessary. And it's also a form of self-care because it's intentional. You're being intentional with setting that boundary and honoring what is best for you. Another reason why boundaries are super cool and really important is that they can function as a built-in timeout. And what that means is that they, when used correctly, can allow us the time and the space to rest without feeling bad, because we all need to take moments to recharge, and it allows us to just take some time to ourselves so that we don't end up snapping on others. Because have you ever been in a situation where you should have said no, like that your boundaries were being violated, but for whatever reason you didn't set that boundary, and ultimately you ended up snapping and either making a situation worse, straining a relationship, or just overall feeling bad that it had to get to that point. When you use your boundaries correctly, there's no need for snapping because you've already said, okay, I'm heading out the ring, I'm gonna take a time out. My third reason for why boundaries are important is that having boundaries allows us to see when other people have boundaries, and it allows us to respect them. Because have you ever been in a situation where someone set a boundary against you and you weren't expecting that, and it made you kind of feel some type of way because you're just like, how dare you set this boundary against me? But in the process of developing your own boundaries, you can then begin to understand maybe why they had that boundary, because now you have your own boundaries. Now you set your own boundaries unapologetically, and it allows you to say, okay, game recognize game, boundaries recognize boundaries, and you set a boundary, it's all good. Because when I need to set my boundaries, I would hope that you also feel as though it's all good. All right, so now you've got your boundaries, you've done some soul searching, you're ready to go out there and prosper. But let's examine those boundaries. Are they too soft, or are they too rigid, or are they just right? It's kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. What it looks like when your boundaries are too soft is when you have a very, very hard time enforcing them. It's almost like, here's the boundary, you've drawn this line in the sand, and somebody just hopscotches right over that line in the sand, because there's no accountability. And a prime example of what it looks like when your boundaries are really soft and not like fully formed is when you continuously find yourself doing things that make you uncomfortable. Because if something makes you feel uncomfortable, then it could be that you are allowing yourself into situations, or you're interacting with individuals that are continuously disregarding your boundaries, but you don't quite know how to vocalize that. This could lead to feelings of resentment of those who have healthy boundaries. So for example, if you have a friend who is every single time they set this boundary, they're unapologetic about it, they know they're doing what's best for them, you might start feeling like, why are they always setting that boundary? But in all honesty, it's this feeling that stems from you not being able to honor your own boundaries. So you're like jealous of your friend that they have the capacity and that capability to honor their boundaries, while you're still here with like everybody and their mama hopscotching over that line in the sand that you drew. And it can also lead to feelings of regret that you have not been able to set firmer boundaries. It can also lead to feelings of regret if you feel as though you have done so many things that made you uncomfortable because you weren't able to set those boundaries. On the other hand, there are super firm boundaries that are just a bit too rigid. And what that means is that you have these boundaries and you rule with them with an iron fist, and there is room for zero adaptability. Sometimes you find yourself using these boundaries when honestly, you really didn't need to use that boundary because it really wasn't that serious. Let's say one of your friends asks if you want to go hang out with them, and you're like, nope, no, I don't want to hang out. No, I don't go out on Saturdays after 8 p.m. No, I'm not going to hang out. And they're just like, okay, I mean, it's cool. I just wanted to show you this new spot. I thought that you would really like it. I went there last week and I thought about you, so I just wanted to spend time with you and introduce you to the place. And you're like, I still don't care. I'm still not going. That is a very, very rigid boundary with like zero wiggle room. Like your social life is struggling to breathe up under that boundary. Envision rigid boundaries like a force field in which no one can access you. And a prime example is if you never open up to others, because that can signify a rigid emotional boundary. And it could stem from the fact that you've been hurt before in the past, and so now you're very fearful of opening up to others or getting to know new individuals. But if you never put yourself out there, then it could lead to feelings of isolation because others might begin to perceive your behavior as a bit off-putting and they might steer clear of you. The best way to enact boundaries is to have a balance of being in between, where you're not gonna let just anybody walk all over you, but at the same time, you're not gonna walk all over yourself and disrespect your own boundaries. With that being said, this is why it's so important to honor your boundaries as well as the boundaries of those around you. Because honoring your boundaries says, hey, I'm in tune with myself and I understand that I need X, Y, and Z right now. And respecting the boundaries of others says, hey, I recognize that you need X, Y, and Z right now. So honestly, it's a win-win situation. It signifies respect and understanding and empathy. One thing to keep in mind is that sometimes we don't always get the story behind the boundary. It could be that someone has set a certain boundary because of something that has happened in the past. And even though we don't know the story behind that boundary, it is still valid and it is still worthy of respect. Now, the moment that everyone has been waiting for, here are 4 tips to help with setting and keeping your boundaries, because it's not enough to just set the boundary, like you have to also adhere to them. My first tip is kind of laying the groundwork, and it is to understand what kinds of boundaries you would like to set and what led you to want to set them. Because if we have insight into why we're setting a particular boundary, then it helps us to act from a place of understanding versus anger and hurt. As an example, let's say that someone is exiting a toxic relationship in which they felt a lot of invalidation. So they might set a lot of mental boundaries in which they communicate to friends and future partners and family members, hey, it is really important for me to feel as though I can speak up on certain things versus being shut down and feeling invalidated. In that instance, they are giving the story behind that, because they might say this boundary stems from a lot of the invalidation that I felt when I was in that relationship. And in enacting that boundary, they both have a greater understanding of maybe the lack of boundaries there were in that relationship and how they can move forward and have not only boundaries, but strong boundaries. Strong, but not rigid. An example of a boundary that I have set in my personal life is to call out when I don't like the way that someone is speaking to me. So for example, if someone is using what I deem to be kind of an aggressive tone of voice or a passive aggressive tone of voice, then I'll just call it out and say, hey, I really don't like the way that you're speaking to me right now. I don't like your tone of voice, because for me, certain tones of voices are triggering. And so I've set this emotional boundary where I'm able to say, hey, I really don't like the way you're speaking to me right now. And for me, that gives me the comfort to know that I don't have to sit there and take it. I can have a voice and I can speak up about it. My next tip is to understand that consistency starts with self. So I'm going to say that again. Consistency starts with self, because I tend to ask myself, if I can't give myself consistency, then how can I ask for consistency from someone else? And that usually helps me to tap into this mindset of, let me respect myself first so that then I can know what that looks like. And when somebody is not respecting me, then I also know what that looks like, because I respect myself enough to put a stop to certain things. Because one thing to note is that more times than not, no one is going to enforce your boundaries for you. If you are feeling uncomfortable in a certain situation, you have to be the one to set that boundary. Someone might take notice and attempt to do some sort of action to set a boundary, but for the most part, you have to be the one to set your boundaries and know when enough is enough. My third tip is to have compassion and empathy for yourself while you're going through this process, because that is something that I find myself saying a lot on this channel because it is so important. Enacting boundaries is an intentional act that can be very, very draining, and it can feel a little difficult. It can feel hard at times. It can also feel discouraging when we don't enact a boundary the way that we really want it to. And it's important to note that you won't effectively draw your boundaries every single time, but you will get better as time goes on. I didn't always start out calling out when I don't like someone's tone towards me, or when I don't like when they're speaking towards me in a certain way, but every single time that I've done it, I felt more and more empowered to say, I know what I deserve, and it does not include the way that I'm being spoken to right now. So it's definitely a journey, and while you're on this journey, make sure that you're being compassionate with yourself and giving yourself love and patience and kindness. My final tip is to take notice of who consistently violates your boundaries. Like, I understand there's going to be an adjustment period if you have previously not had boundaries and now you are trying to be a bit more proficient at setting up and enacting those boundaries. So there will be like a transition period in which the people in your life are learning what's okay and not okay. But if there is someone in your life who every single time, like, they are just violating that boundary and they don't seem to care, then that might signal a greater issue at hand concerning this individual in your life, and that might need some attention, and that might signify a healthy friendship or relationship, which I also have a video about that you should definitely check out. So yeah, I definitely just said healthy right now and I meant unhealthy, but yeah, you should still check out the video. Finally, I would like to touch on how enforcing boundaries can be very uncomfortable. If you have difficulty with being assertive and telling others no, then it might be difficult when it's time to tell a friend, a family member, or a boss no. And I feel like enforcing boundaries is not something that comes second nature to a lot of people. There are some people who, from an early age, they're able to feel comfortable in that way and telling others how they will and won't be treated. But for the vast majority of us, we don't really have that luxury, and enforcing boundaries is something that we really have to grow into. And so if you struggle with being assertive, then it's easy to feel as though you just can't enact those boundaries or enforce those boundaries. And I'm here to tell you that you can. Like, don't listen to that voice in the back of your brain. You can definitely enforce the boundaries. It's just something that you're gonna have to keep practicing and trying out. Sometimes you win and sometimes you don't win. Enforcing boundaries can also be a bit uncomfortable because it requires you to tap into your own wants and needs versus the wants and needs of others. And there's been a lot of conditioning in society that has led us to believe that we have to put the wants and needs of others over our own. And you can find that a lot with work-life balance. So for example, working 40 hours a week, but we all know that that's code for, yes, you're working 40 hours a week, but if you didn't get that assignment done, then you're probably at home still working on that assignment, and that leaves work-life balance to be desired. Or, if you have a family, then, wanting to put your family's wants and needs over your own. And that is completely cultural, but in society, there's this conditioning that we should come second. When in all honesty, I'm not saying that you should stop caring about others. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that you should pour into yourself as much as you pour into others. And when I say pour into, I mean give yourself time, give yourself energy, just listen to yourself. And if I'm being quite honest, you should pour into yourself a little bit more than you pour into others, because let's face it, you are worth that extra fluid ounce. Also, enforcing boundaries can put you at odds with others. So as you are going through this journey of enforcing your boundaries, there might be that one family member or friend or colleague who does not like this new boundary. And that can really strain a relationship. And in some extreme cases, if you are enacting or enforcing a boundary in an unhealthy relationship, and can ultimately bring that relationship or friendship to an end. Just know that you are worth the boundaries that you set, and that it won't be easy, but ultimately you are doing what is best for you. So this concludes another video, and thank you so much for watching. As always, I hope that you learned something new and that I was able to bring a different perspective to the table regarding boundaries. I'd love to hear in the comments below about your own personal journey with boundaries. Are you still trying to set boundaries? Have you set boundaries, and have they been welcomed? Have they put strains in your relationship? I would love to hear about that in the comments below. And as always, please give this video a like if you liked what I had to say regarding the topic. Also share this video with a friend if you like. Subscribe and join the virtual party if you like, and I will pop my Instagram over here where you can follow for mental wellness content that will help to brighten up your Instagram feed. And overall, I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Jazz out. Don't forget to drink some water and give yourself a hug.